Exactly. It's loading up now. Hi, everybody. This is our fantasy discussion with fantasy author Josh Dunn. Josh is the author of the Overlord series, as well as uh, the Tower Lords. Would you like to give the rest of your background?
Yeah, I actually have a degree in economics and political science from Hillsdale. I've done a bunch of analysis on political campaigns. I've actually worked on some. I work for an international business company. So my specialty is taking real world analysis and being able to apply it to a fantasy world setting or a science fiction world setting to avoid a lot of the traps that make it hard to immerse yourself in the story because the realism is killed.
Yes. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Josh's books. I read I read his Overlord series, as well as his, I'm forgetting the name of it. It's Zombies. Both of them are 5 out of 5 star books. Very funny, well written, good characters. I enjoyed them a lot. And so we're here to talk about what world building like, because I feel like this fan base has a lot of interest in that, and that we can tap into that. Yeah. So
Exactly.
my first question is, how do you build fantasy worlds and in which you can have dwarves and dragons and all that stuff, but prevent it from becoming completely ridiculous?
Mhm. I think the first step is really just to there's different ways of doing it. You can either set yourself in the story, in a pre-existing story where you want it to be, but then you have to backtrack and decide how everything led up to that point. And so you're going to have to do exactly what you do in your videos, where you break it down and you say, okay, if these people start with these advantages and this sort of geography, what would happen if this
Yes.
happened? Or you can build it from the ground up, which I know that people like Brandon Sanderson do. They start from the foundation of the world and they work their way forward. Now they have a target in their head, but they're always developing it step by step. And if something doesn't logically lead toward down the path they want, they sometimes have to go back, change something, and then keep writing the history. So just like every author has a giant glossary on their computer of all the people, places, and names that they have in their book, they could also have a giant timeline of how things unfold. And so I know some authors who have giant wall-sized whiteboards where they actually take a special paint their wall in it so they can actually graph out the entire path of the world that they're working on. And then, of course, they'll scan that and save it into a computer. So there's a lot of ways of going about it, but the important part is to make sure that it all makes sense logically, and you're not just doing something because it's the rule of cool, because the rule of cool matters, but only in context of what you've created.
Yeah. I really like the Brandon Sanderson's world as well, where, like, something I didn't realize is that crustaceans are the main form of life in that world. Because for those of you who don't know, in his world, you've got the giant electrical storms that roll through. This is the Radiant series. And so all life has to, or a large part of the continent has to tunnel underground. And crustaceans are the thing that would survive the best of that, because they've got the best tunneling abilities. And that's not something he says, that's something he shows really well in the world building.
Even the grass,
Yeah.
if you disturb it, it'll
Yeah.
suck down into holes.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, I think that's an interesting thing for alternate history, and it makes alternate history a lot easier than fantasy, because we already know who the Germans are, we know who the Russians are, and so we know their backstory, although we oftentimes don't consciously think about it. And but for fantasy, you have to construct that all from the ground up. And I think a big thing, I think it's very easy in fantasy to construct like races that are just copies of real world races, like the Nazis and the Mongols and stuff, for like space Nazis, space Romans. And what do you think about
Everybody
having
loves a good space Roman, though.
exactly the Imperium of Mankind from 40K is basically just the Roman Empire in the year 400 shoved into space. Yeah, but I think it's complicated where you like people, we love these archetypes. Like everyone loves the Vikings and you want to have fantasy Vikings, but you don't want to get too boring and just have Vikings. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the best way to do something like that, you can also do it in fantasy, but it's a little harder. The way that cultures develop in the real world is isolation and limited amounts of cross contamination with other cultures.
Yes.
So an easy way to do that in, say, science fiction is to put a civilization on a planet that is primarily colonized by people from a certain group, and then have, for some reason, they're isolated. Like there's a huge war, there's something wrong with space travel, something like that. And whenever you have something in a microcosm, it always intensifies. Be that a certain type of extremism, be it cultural activity, people tend to go back to their roots. It's an echo chamber, and so the more it goes back and forth and the less outside influence, the more it's going to amplify, just like a sine wave.
Yeah, and you get that in real history where you've got like Japan evolved so differently from the rest of the world because it was so split off from the rest of the world. Or if you look at the British settlement of North America, you had self-selection of certain groups in Britain, and then they just talked to the other. Like the Puritans were the most religious radicals, and they went to America and they started doing witch burnings, and they like passed laws saying that you couldn't argue with your wife or you get fined for it. And so stuff like that, where it's in isolation and self-selection, you can see really weird results.
I think you really hit a good point when you talk about self-selection, because anytime there's frontier people or people colonizing a new place, it's always automatically a self-selected group, unless you have an external societal force that says, we are forcibly taking you and we're moving you over here.
Yeah.
A really good example of this is during the Soviet era. Stalin took a whole bunch of Koreans that were living in the Vladivostok region, and he forcibly relocated them over into, I think it's Kazakhstan. And so you go to Kazakhstan today, and there's a huge ethnically Korean population there. And they're not a self-selected group. So the Korean culture basically vanished from this group, simply because it is an artificially selected for group. So it depends on the type of authoritarianism that causes the move, whether it's state-sponsored or individually sponsored.
Yeah, I never thought of that. That's fascinating. Where, like, I mean, for like the migration to Israel is the opposite, where the people who went to Israel, the people who wanted to go there, and they were able to maintain Jewish culture. But if Stalin said, no one thinks about the Jewish community where Stalin said, you Jews, you're going to move to the Jewish oblast in Siberia. They completely lost their culture because it's the opposite. Yeah.
And that's actually something that the Persian Empire used with great effect. Where they would uproot entire populations and try to disperse them into others in order to eliminate all identity other than the Persian identity. One group specifically that it didn't work with was the Jewish group. They tend to be the butt of a lot of relocations.
Time and time again. Do you have any unpopular opinions on fantasy worlds you think were well constructed and ones that were not well constructed?
Unpopular opinions. Asking someone for an unpopular opinion. There was one I read recently. Let me go look at my library. While I'm looking that up, I think that my most unpopular opinions have to do with science fiction, because a lot of modern day wish fulfillment when it comes to ideology or economics are played out in science fiction. One that is always sticks out in my mind is Star Trek, where they claim to be a moneyless society when they still use credits. And when the Ferengi use a similar thing, it's simply, gold plus platinum, that's somehow bad, because it is not a fiat currency, which is what the credit is. And because the evil capitalist stand-ins, the Ferengi, like it. So, I mean, a lot of times when you find poor world building, you'll find a contradiction elsewhere in the work, because if it doesn't work in the real world, they're going to have to contradict themselves in order to set up a different situation that they want for a different plot. And
Yes.
either a different writer doesn't remember that that happened, or the original writer may not even remember that they did one thing. And so they will constantly, anything that doesn't make actual sense will contradict itself. So really, when you talk about bad world building, it's something that's going to kick you out of the ability to suspend disbelief. Because anytime we dive into science fiction or fantasy, it's all about the suspension of disbelief, how far you can go with that. And when you're building a world, you only have so much. I like, since I have an economics background, I like to think of it as capital spend. How much can you spend on this? You have to look at everything you're going to do and say, okay, how expensive is this in the suspension of disbelief? Is this going to add to it or take away from it? So what we've been talking about up to now is how to add to that ability to suspend disbelief by adding a lot of logical, historical trends. How would people move, that sort of thing. But of course, you throw a dragon in there, that's a very expensive creature when it comes to the ability to suspend disbelief. So you have to say, okay, if I have $100 of suspension of disbelief, that's probably going to take up 27 of it or something like that.
Yes. Yeah, I think of that in your books, where it seems like you're building a mechanism for unrealistic things to happen, but you have that inside a magical, like, you have almost an economics of unrealistic things to happen. Like, and I can see why you were doing that. Like, you'll have things where, like, where a dog will gather, and sorry, spoilers, a dog will gather an army of ogres behind it. But then there is an economic system of suspension of disbelief behind it that I see now.
Yeah, it's all about, it's easier to develop an actual economic system of activity when it's a lit RPG, because inside a game system like that, you can make everything line up. And so it does become much more clear, much more quickly, how, cause and effect, where if you want to get X, you got to do Y, and you got to do it in a certain way.
The fans want answered your question on tips on how to grow such a majestic beard.
Patience, lots and lots of patience, because I guarantee lesson 1, it will look horrible at some point. And also a good beard oil.
Yeah, I get that. First time I tried to grow out my beard, it went too long down, and so I had to keep it shaved tight on the side to prevent it from just extending downwards for too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, an interesting thought.
Also, to write the wizard, you must become the wizard.
Explain.
Well, the wizard beard.
Oh, I thought of it in those terms. Sorry. Unpopular opinion on my part, I don't think Game of Thrones is that imaginative world building, because it seems like he just ripped off 15th century England.
Well, he even took the map.
Yeah, it's England on top of Ireland. Like, for a couple parts of Game of Thrones, I could just predict the plot from knowing the Wars of the Roses. I could line it up with historic figures and then just see what was going to happen.
Well, George R. Martin is a story pirate. He took historical activity that most people are not aware of. And the great thing about history is it's already a really good story because it actually happened, which means it's completely believable. So his foundation for building his fantasy story on it is super easy. Yeah. So all he has to do is focus on throwing in some really clever characters like Tyrion, and then make sure not to go too heavy into the fantasy stuff right away. And I mean, hindsight is 2020, but looking back on that, it's like, okay, why didn't 10 other authors try to do that beforehand?
Yeah. It always shocks me why more fantasy and sci-fi doesn't pull on history, because for all the reasons you just gave, where it's pre-existingly awesome. Like, Josh and I've had a couple of conversations of just different historical periods that it would be so easy to have a fantasy novel about, like the Bronze Age or the fall of Rome or stuff like that.
Or even the Mongolian invasions.
Yeah.
In all the fantasy or sci-fi, they always defeat the invaders.
Yeah.
What about one where they don't defeat the invaders?
Exactly. Or where the invaders
live under the new system.
Yeah. I mean, that was Mistborn basically, but Mistborn was way, way after.
Yeah, it was 1,000 years after.
I mean, that's a kind of the domination of the Draca, but are you aware of that series?
Yeah, I watched your video.
Yeah. For the fans that don't know, the Domination of the Draca is a alternate history series at a world where basically apartheid South Africa takes over the world and enslaves all of mankind. And it's parts of it are amusing, but I generally didn't like it because I didn't like the writing style. And it gets kind of unrealistic at points where they like drop a zombie plague that turns all of North America into zombies. And they completely throw the economics of suspension of disbelief out the window with that one, where they conquer all of Africa in like a 40-year period. I don't know why I brought them up, to be honest, but yeah.
Because it's a poor version of alternate history.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's very easy to basically ignore the historical process and then take it off in whatever direction you want to go off, and then you end up doing the story a disservice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's where you hyper focus on one thing, and that's actually one of the big pitfalls of writing, is where you hyper focus on one element. A lot of people don't like the modern fantasy young adult where it hyper focuses on the personal aspects, and they spend a little bit of time in the beginning of the story developing the world, but then you realize that they've only discussed 3 or 4 different nations, and then the world kind of ends after that. There's nothing else, and it's supposed to be some huge conquering empire, and it's like, okay, either this world is very tiny and this empire is very close to finishing the job, or the author's completely lazy.
Yeah, it's very easy just to have an alternate history, call it the big red blob, like the giant empire you just don't like, where everyone's a single culture, everyone unanimously leads up to the ruling emperor. And I mean, in reality, empires rule through consent. Even the worst empires have a ruling class that works for them for a reason, and a plurality of the population wants to work with them for some incentive or another.
Exactly. And nobody's going to work for the truly evil overlord that wants to destroy everything, because they live in everything.
Yeah, exactly. Did the economics in Middle Earth ever bother you?
Yes. Especially the technological disparity, and the fact that certain cultures would have already completely supplanted basically all other cultures. They make it pretty clear in the books that the Easterlings were far more technologically advanced than the men of the West, and they were also more conquest driven. So it makes zero sense that they hadn't already competed every other culture in existence.
Yeah, I also felt that way with population growth, where you've got these massive open spaces, and then you've got Bree. Like in the real world, you'd think Bree, which is this tiny farm town in the thousands of miles of frontier around it with nothing, they would have just had 9 kids and expanded across the whole western part of Middle Earth. But no.
That's the complete absence of math in fiction, especially fantasy fiction. You'll find that in science fiction, there's a lot better examinations. So as you're talking about the exponential growth of population, if every family has 9 kids, 7 of them survive to adulthood, then those 7 have 7, and within 3 or 4 generations, you completely covered the area. Another thing that really bugs me is actually going back to science fiction again, because I've actually done more talks like this about science fiction than fantasy. But one thing where everybody just completely misses the mark is invading a populated world. So Earth has 7-8 billion people on it right now. Of those 7 or 8 billion, 1 out of every 10, very conservatively, is capable of fighting in one way, shape, or form. If Earth was getting invaded by an alien force, you'd have at least 1 billion people fighting back, trying to keep their planet. It would take a million, even if you had a 1,000x multiplier in terms of technology and armor and weaponry for your people, it would take millions upon millions of soldiers in order to take it. So you're not going to pull into orbit with a couple of star destroyers and be able to take a planet. You could bombard the planet, you could get the government to surrender, but you're not going to be able to take and hold the planet.
You could have a situation like War of the Worlds, however, where the technological disparity is so massive that So in like War of the Worlds technology of 100 plus years ago, the aliens could have landed and there was nothing we could do to stop them. And then they just blow all the technology out of the water. Yeah.
True, but they still didn't land with a couple of star destroyers worth of troops. They landed with enough Tri-walkers to cover the planet. So even then, it's still a lot larger than most science fiction shows did demonstrate planetary invasions.
Yeah, they have bring one massive ship and then they completely, and then nothing else basically. The one they've got like a ship over New York, a ship over Shanghai, a ship over London, etc. And then that's the invasion force. Something that really, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just thinking.
Yeah. Something that really bugs me about alien invasion stories is they never have them having conventional warfare. It's like they never treat it as an actual fight. They just have aliens attack big cities and Deus Ex Machina. And that's what I really love about Harry Turtle's World War series. For those of you who don't know, it's a book where aliens invade the Earth during World War II, and then it's a traditional war for like 1,000 pages afterwards with big battles and all that stuff fought over terrain. And I really liked it because it portrayed like an actual war and there was feeling of actual tension in it. And a very interesting aspect is the aliens thought they'd invade the Earth in the 12th century, and so they completely undermanned it. And then technological progress happened at a massive speed that they hadn't factored in because humanity's technological progress up to that was far slower. And then that evened out the odds.
Yeah, I mean, he's the great granddaddy of alternate history. So
Yeah.
he did a really good job, and he was very slow and methodical about it. This is actually another way of world building and to make sure that you do it right. A lot of people try to jump into the changes they want to make. This is actually one of the things that really bugs me is when people put their social agenda ahead of the story. And so they say, I want to make this the focus. And then they don't actually write a story about it. They put a very loose story on it. It kind of meanders up into that point. Whereas Turtle Dove, he actually took the perspective of a couple of nobodies. And that's the prism through which we see the story. So there's no way for it to hyper accelerate along a sociological path that he wants to talk about or some issue that he wants to talk about. It has to focus on a story in order to eventually get to his point.
Yeah, Turtle Dove, it would be so easy for all of Turtle Dove's books for him to basically just go into to get kind of, I don't want to say preachy, but for him to just get too stuck on sociological theories and trying to put across an ideological agenda. But for all of Turtle Dove's books, you've got Soviet characters who are thinking from a Soviet perspective, Nazi characters are thinking from a Nazi perspective, American characters are thinking from an American perspective, Jewish characters thinking from a Jewish perspective. And so it's a good image of how the world was in that era, even as alien characters in that one. The big thing I dislike about Turtle Dove, though, is that his series are way too long. It's like his American Civil War series is 11 books long, and it just feels like he's unnecessarily dragging it out. And it sometimes feels like there are so many characters that you don't really like any of them that much.
It's like he took inspiration from Robert Jordan. Let me take 3 hours to describe this house outfit of the Aes Sedai.
Yeah.
I found the one I was thinking of when you asked what is a really poorly done book. Hominids by Robert J. Sawyer. Basically, have you read this one or heard of this one?
No, I haven't.
Okay. He came from a very strong political perspective, and he said, okay, what if there's an alternate version of Earth where instead of humanity getting wiped out, Homo sapiens, it was Homo erectus that survived, and humanity got displaced. And so he took everything he didn't like about society, and then he took that away, and he made the Neanderthal society literally an ideal system, perfection embodied. And it was for no other reason than they're just better than humans because they do it how I like. And there's not really any explanation other than, but that makes sense. That's how you're supposed to do it. If you weren't selfish, that's how you would do it. And the end result is all of the Neanderthals don't come across as people. They come across as just basically NPCs.
Yeah.
Poorly constructed. And the one conflict he does show on the Neanderthal side is it's a very poorly constructed love triangle. And as any
It's
writer
always
can
that.
tell you, as any writer can tell you, the love triangle is the laziest social problem that you can create in a story. Literally the laziest. It is the easiest thing to throw in a story.
Yeah.
Everybody knows the basic components of a love triangle, and it's super easy to imply it. You don't even have to say it. You just have to write a few lines in a certain way, sprinkle them throughout a couple of chapters, and you got your subplot.
Yes, it's because good writing comes from tension, and the love triangle has no tension. It's, am I going to go with the hot guy or the nice guy? And that's not really tension. It's just it's two good choices. It's like comedy.
That's also why Game of Thrones was very popular, is because he went for alternate means of tension, knives in the back, power plays, that sort of thing. People are starved for that because all the fiction that's coming out right now is love triangle or trumped up, things that don't matter. And it's like they don't resonate with people today, because people don't fundamentally change. You take somebody, you have a completely different origin story, you have them grow up as a farm boy in the middle of nowhere riding dragons, and they're fundamentally the same. They're going to want a good meal at the end of the day. They're going to want a good, nice warm bed. They're going to want a cold beer. So, people are people.
I feel like there's a dualism where on one side you've got the sappy love triangles, nothing happens. The other side is people are trying to be like Game of Thrones. They don't have any of the tension of Game of Thrones, where it's just grimdark without understanding why the grimdark works, where it's like, I'm going to make everyone unnecessarily mean in this plot. I'm going to have no jokes. I'm going to make every single character evil and every single country evil. So like the Malazan books, big fantasy epic, I had to read them. I had to stop reading them end of the third book because I realized there wasn't a single character I liked in it, and not a single country I was rooting for. And all of the characters were too depressed to actually be real people. Like none of them had goals. Like no one was falling in love. There was no one wanted to do anything. It was just the characters didn't even act like they wanted to live that much.
The copy paste problem exists in a lot of genres, and it's always going to plague everything, because somebody sees something that's popular, maybe they're slightly inspired by it, they don't fully understand what made it resonate with people, they don't understand what we're talking about, what makes something real, and so they say, I'm going to double down on the thing that everybody is talking about. And what everybody was talking about was a grimdark of, they didn't necessarily call it grimdark, but fantasy grimdark, which is what George Martin did. And so there's going to be tons of copy paste grimdarks out there for the fantasy genre. Now we're starting to see that taper back down, and unfortunately, the even worse genre is starting to come back, of the crappy love triangle in the fantasy world.
Yeah. Back to that point, I would make the argument that Star Wars ruined the film industry for that very reason, because Star Wars made such a ridiculous amount of money that everyone wanted to repeat it. But repeating Star Wars involved big actors, massive budgets, big explosions, and then it created everyone trying to hit the blockbuster rather than film studios trying to make medium amounts of money on smaller budget films and release a lot of them.
Yeah, and you get a lot of crappy, bad CGI, bad story writing, just explosion fests. One series, though, that actually took the grand imperial, galaxy-spanning empire story, which isn't necessarily unique. I mean, that's basically China's, entire history, where there's always been one empire that, for all intents and purposes, ruled the world, and everybody was trying to supplant that empire with their empire. Is Galaxy's Edge. I don't know if you've read that science fiction series, but absolutely top notch. As an author, I loved it.
Never read it.
Great world building, great character development, lots of snark, and the audiobook version is read by my favorite audiobook narrator.
Yeah, the big empire trope really annoys me, because across most of history, you see lots of squabbling little states, but in sci-fi, especially as it's always the empire, and it's never And at most in sci-fi, you're going to get three factions. And in fantasy, like you might get like six countries. Sci-fi, it's always like three at the most. And I think it's the assumption is that as we move forward in the future, we're going to see more and more centralization, even though once you go out into space, everything will incentivize it towards decentralization.
Exactly, because the civilizations we have today are great at keeping cohesive societies and cohesive cultures for the same thing we talked about in the very beginning is there's instant communication. So you can't have that microcosm isolation, which clearly would not be possible in science fiction. Even if we do manage to crack faster than light travel, which I think we have, because I mean, there's already warp field theory and stuff like that going around. You're going to have time delay for couriers to go back and forth between different parts of your civilization. And also that math problem we were talking about at the very beginning. People forget just how huge a single galaxy is. And if you can make it from one end of our galaxy to the other, you can make it to another galaxy within a couple of years. So, people seem to think, oh, it's isolated. There's only winner take all of the galaxy. And it's like, no, even with the big empires of Rome and China, the Mongol Empire, there was always tons of peripheral empires that were either tributaries or protectorates or squabbling enemies. And that's where a lot of the politics took place. A lot of the core intrigue of these countries was not about internal lords duking it out. It was about who's going to manipulate those peripheral countries into giving them an advantage when they're taken over or break away or one of those type of things.
Yes. Yeah. That's something I feel a lot with science fiction and fantasy, where you need to be able to balance having an actual plot with making this cohesive worldview. And when you write a 1,000-page book, it often you're just turning away readers. Where Brandon Sanderson's like awesome, but it takes me so long to get through his books, and he's one of the few sci-fi. I feel like you have to. Oftentimes, you choose between the characters and the fantasy world, and it's very difficult to master both without just maxing out the page limit.
Yeah, I mean, book 1 and book 2 of his Stormlight Archives were really good. Book 3, though, at some points, it's just like, okay, you've already done this 4 times now, because he does write in a very cyclical pattern that gets a little predictive. And it's like, okay, you've already described this part of the culture many times. Can we hurry it up a little bit?
Yeah. To be fair, I think historical fiction writers have something to learn from fantasy writers, because as a fantasy writers have to explain their fantasy world from the ground up, basically. And for a lot of historical fiction, they just assumed that people back then were like they are now. And I would actually prefer historical fiction to be written more like fantasy, of explaining how weird life back then was. Like when you read historical medieval fiction, no one talks about how like entire families would sleep naked in the same bed, or like how people would have giant torture events in the middle. Like people would literally pull tendons away from political opponents in the street, and that would be a family event to watch. And
people don't realize how brutal life was. And what you're looking for is called the Everyman. Fantasy authors are very aware that you have to put an everyman in your story to stand in for the reader, where things need to be explained to that character so that they're explained to the reader. In my stories, it's super easy because it's someone from modern day civilization. So that everyman literally is an everyman. So in historical fantasy, though, it's a little harder to get that in there unless you're kind of combining that portal fantasy with the historical fantasy, which is where what was that?
Time travel.
Time travel. Time travel is a great one. Doesn't necessarily have to be time travel. Could be alternate dimensions. One of the stories that I really liked by S.M. Sterling, I know you don't like some of his work, but some of his other stuff.
I like some of his stuff. I like Peshawar Lancers is my favorite alternate history of all time.
The one that I like that didn't even get an Audible treatment was Conquistador, which is basically there's a portal to an alternate Earth where it didn't develop, and so the historical things are kind of locked in place in kind of the Alexandrian time, and I think he does a great job of explaining that world, except we don't get to experience more than just this settlement area in California and Oregon. Whereas I think that it would be super interesting to follow these characters as they see more of the wider world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like for medieval America, I like, for those of you who don't know, I made a scenario at what America be medieval technology. And I've gotten a lot of comments saying that people would want me to expand across the whole world. And honestly, just doing America was so much work that I don't want to move into South America. And that would be the logical next step. And
We need to have some of the basics in order for them to be able, the culture in North America to work properly.
Yeah, I mean, a majority, so much of my fan base is in North America or Europe that I don't think a South America video would be worthwhile doing. I'm sorry, South American
I'm not saying
fans.
you do it. I'm saying that you probably have a bunch of stuff that happened in South America in your head in order to have done the North American video.
Yeah.
I'm actually writing one where it's a slow burn, so it's probably not going to be out for several years.
Yes.
But it's an alternate history where the Viking colonies in America took off.
Yeah.
And
wow.
And so they didn't really colonize, but they had some people from Rome that became basically like advisors to the people who were in charge there. And so, and he was obsessed with classical Rome, not just medieval Rome, like they were working on, because that's an area where, it was starting to fade into the background. People were starting to lose the remembrance of Rome, but not quite. There was still a lot of historical activity. So what they did was basically they offered a service to the rest of Europe. Instead of colonizing Normandy and places like that, they realized they can make a lot of money by shipping off undesirables to places where they're out of the way. And so North America becomes this weird amalgam of all these ejected undesirables from the rest of Europe and expanded rest of the world. And so you get this weird melting pot, but for a completely different reason, and still having the historical mindset of people back then.
Yeah, that's close to what happened in real terms. I was actually thinking
just
about
accelerate it, a couple hundred years.
Yeah, I was thinking about that very scenario. I was thinking of how badass it would be to have a Viking colonization of the New World. And in this scenario, I was thinking of, you would have Vikings up in Quebec, and then like the Normans and other European groups, the rest of the East Coast. And that over time you would see a Viking expedition go to the Proto-Aztec Empire and sack it, and that you would gradually see the formation of native kingdoms that would take European technology and stuff, and that it would be like a geopolitical series as you see the machinations of like the Europeans interacting with the New World, but with Vikings rather than Spaniards, basically.
Yeah, and also it would give the natives a much more of a fighting chance, because they would have longer time to recover from the European diseases before the true critical mass of European colonists would arrive. So it creates a much more level playing field.
Yeah. And although gunpowder wasn't a massive factor, that would also be out. And I mean, the biggest advantage the Spaniards had was horses, and the Vikings didn't bring over many horses because that wasn't their main style of combat. That would also level the playing field a bit more.
Well, the Vikings, they loved water travel, so the Great Lakes and the Mississippi rivers is really their strongholds, because they would row up the river.
Exactly. What are your thoughts on usage of like traditional fantasy tropes like dwarves, elves, etc.? Orcs.
At the same time, I love it, but it's also problematic. What's even worse, though, is when you call something a new fantasy creature and all it is an existing fantasy creature. So you can do that as long as you acknowledge that it's actually an existing fantasy creature.
Yes.
And maybe these guys call it something different, or they were wrong about this, or there's a historical memory that's slightly changed by modern media.
Yes.
So it's like in the Tower Lord series, all of our historical fantasies, creatures, goblins, fae, stuff like that, they all come from things that actually interacted with us a couple thousand years ago. And of course, our memory of them, our collective zeitgeist has drifted since then. And while zeitgeist does matter, anybody who actually reads the book and sees how the magic system works, the zeitgeist matters, but it's also different than what they physically are. Making up new creatures is great. I love it. I've done it myself. I have them in book 2. I really double down on the idea of a new creature that I created, whole culture and everything like that. How to be, I try to take the approach because a lot of people, so I'm an economist, which means I'm very much a capitalist, which means I very much believe in individualism. So I tried to explore the idea of a collectivist culture that was not necessarily a bad culture because of its historical background and the biological markers that allow it to exist. And so that was one of the big things I explore in book 2 of that series. So if you do it right, if you're willing to put the elbow grease in, absolutely make up a new creature. But everything we've been talking about building it from the ground up, you got to do that twice just to make sure that species makes sense, because it costs the throwing some elves in, that might cost you 20 coins of suspension of disbelief. But making up your own species, it kind of sort of is a little bit elf-like. That's going to cost you 30 or 40 instead of 20.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good amount of it is that you've got these pre-existing shorthands that people like because they're reading fantasy. I mean, most people who read fantasy already like elves or dwarves because they're reading fantasy. And so if you're not, like, lots of people think it's basic to use elves and dwarves and stuff. I don't think that, because your job is to tell a story. And if you need to spend some stuff of creativity in order to get a better story across without expanding your page limit, I'm fine with that. And that's the way it is with those different fantasy races. And oftentimes it's, as you said, like, I feel like a certain amount of fantasy writers would just create a race who are literally the dwarves and then call them the Dwens to not feel like Tolkien. And I feel like there's,
it's only a problem when they act like they came up with it. And it's the way you write it that matters. So you can drop some dwarves in, you can drop them in with another name, and it's all about how you do that makes it, whether you're slapping Tolkien in the face or whether you're just using a component that's easy to slot in your book. Because let's face it, dwarves are a component. They're a very important component to modern fantasy, and people already have an entire set of assumptions that you can write in there, and you don't have to do any work.
I mean, I'm going to say I really love the Warhammer fantasy world, partially for historical. I mean, I love it because it takes the fantasy tropes we all love and then drops a bunch of history on it. And as a history nut, I love those two combined. And I love, it's basic, but it's rich in its basicness. Like a coffee shop that's emulating Starbucks, but does it slightly better. And
I absolutely love the Warhammer lore. Can't stand the actual game. I can't play the game.
It's far too expensive.
I just don't find it fun. There's a dozen other things I would rather do than play Warhammer. But I love reading. I love reading the lore.
I entirely understand where it's like, I don't want to spend my Saturday nights spending 4 hours playing Warhammer. But I love reading about this world that's the 16th century with dragons, because that's what I want to be. I mean, that's not what I want to be, but it's where I'm at.
Everybody wants to ride dragons until they realize it's very possible to fall off. I think one of the most horrifying thought experiences I ever had was when I was really, really deep into, because when you get into writing, sometimes you can just get so into a character that it's almost synonymous with experiencing what the character is. You can literally traumatize yourself at the end of your own writing. And so there was one scene where I was writing where a character is literally sucked out of a space station that was deorbiting, and he falls from space. And just the existential dread of that happening is probably one of the most terrifying thought experiments I've ever done.
It's crazy how I feel like science fiction and fantasy can really tap into the most horrifying parts of like the parts of your brain you would never go to otherwise. Like,
Mhm.
do you know I have no mouth and must scream?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. For the fans who don't know, it's a sci-fi book about an evil AI robot that basically tortures the last five humans for 100 plus years, and then the humans are to commit suicide, except one, which it transforms into a giant gelatinous mess that can't commit suicide. That
Yeah, and also he alters his perception of time so the torture
yeah,
lasts for an eternity.
exactly. Yeah, the author said that it was a representation of hell, and it was like trying to write like a modern version of hell.
He did.
Yeah,
He succeeded.
exactly. So we're running out of time. Do you have anything else to say? Any final points?
No, I mean we hit on some basic things. Anything else I would bring up would be, a whole extra can of worms that would be another couple of hours on their own.
Yeah. Well, okay. Good talking to you. Take care.
Absolutely. Oh, and I'm
Yes.
actually going to be giving away a few of the T-shirts from my story. So, going to give away
Yes.
probably about two at the end of the week. So, anybody who wants to tweet out a picture of the first page of any of my books will be entered to win.
Yeah. Josh's books are really great. Click the link in the description to start reading them. Um, and take care, guys. See you guys later.